On a winter morning in 1970, a young airman walked into the shadows of Keesler Air Force Base and was never seen again, not even a footprint in the Mississippi soil. His bed was made, his uniform neatly folded, his life abruptly abandoned as if someone had pressed erase on a human being. For more than 50 years, the disappearance of Alan Roger Bourque has gnawed at investigators, soldiers, and strangers obsessed with the impossible. How does a trained serviceman vanish inside one of America's most tightly controlled military installations? Rumors surfaced: escape, abduction, cover-up, each theory more unsettling than the last, yet every trail ends the same way, in silence. We reopen the file the Air Force never solved, a file built on contradictions, missing records, and a timeline that refuses to make sense. What happened to the airman who walked off the map? Let's begin. The first light of February 9th, 1970 crept across the Mississippi coastline, casting a pale, metallic glow over Keesler Air Force Base. It should have been an ordinary morning. Morning roll call, drills, the steady rhythm of trainees moving through their routines. Instead, it marked the beginning of one of the most baffling disappearances in the history of the base. The day a young airman, barely 19, seemed to dissolve into thin air. Alan Roger Bourque's bunk looked almost staged in its stillness. His sheets were tight, corners tucked with the precision drilled into every new recruit. His locker was organized, boots polished, identification tags hanging neatly beside his folded uniform. To a casual observer, it looked like a soldier preparing for another day. But to Sergeant William Hayes, who stepped into the barracks that morning, something felt off. An unexplainable stillness, as though the room was holding its breath. Hayes scanned the row of beds and paused at Alan's empty one. Missing morning roll call happened, but rarely without some kind of interruption. A half-dressed recruit stumbling in late, an excuse muttered between breaths. But Alan had not been seen since dawn. There were no signs he had rushed out. No loose laces, no unmade sheets, no personal items scattered. It was the kind of neatness that didn't fit the chaos of a sudden departure. By 6:10 a.m., Lieutenant Maria Fletcher was already reviewing the attendance logs. Alan's absence wasn't just unexpected. It wasn't logical. He had no disciplinary issues, no reports of conflict with other airmen, no medical conditions that could signal a sudden emergency. Just days before, he had completed a communications training module and received strong marks. Everything suggested stability, routine, predictability, and yet he was gone. A quiet urgency rippled through the chain of command. Hayes checked the mess hall. Fletcher checked the medical wing. Another officer checked the outdoor training fields. No one had seen the young airman. Just before 7 a.m., a trainee claimed he thought he had spotted Alan near the hallway leading to the administrative wing, walking fast, head lowered, jacket unbuttoned despite the cold. When asked if Alan said anything, the trainee hesitated before admitting he wasn't sure the man was Alan at all. "It looked like him," he said, but something was strange. He didn't move like he normally did. The statement was too vague to be useful, but too unsettling to ignore. What made the situation more perplexing was that there was no record of Alan leaving the base through any of the checkpoints. Every entrance and exit, even in 1970, kept basic logs. His name wasn't among them. No taxi had picked him up. No military transport reported him on board. His identification card was missing from his room, but that alone proved nothing. In some cases, it meant he carried it with him. In others, it suggested someone else had taken it. At 8 a.m., the first whispers began among the other airmen. Some said he panicked about training. Others claimed he had talked about wanting to return to New Orleans. A few suggested he had argued with Airman Scott Delaney the night before. Delaney, when questioned, admitted they had exchanged sharp words over shared equipment, but insisted it was nothing serious. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, though whether from fear, guilt, or pressure, no one could say. Investigators combed through Alan's belongings. Everything pointed toward normalcy, except for one small notebook tucked beneath his mattress. Most of its pages were filled with mundane training notes, but near the back, several pages had been torn out. The final remaining entry was short, cryptic, and written in an unsteady hand. "If something happens, remember what I said. Don't trust the first story." The message had no date, no context, and no explanation. It felt like a warning, or perhaps a confession, but it offered no direction. Before noon, search teams expanded into wooded areas bordering the base. The thick undergrowth, tangled branches, and patches of swampy terrain made the area difficult to navigate. A group of airmen found a partial boot print half buried in mud, standard military issue, possible but not definitive. A quarter-mile deeper, they found a broken branch, then another, as though someone had pushed through in haste. But the trail ended abruptly. The forest swallowed its secrets. By mid-afternoon, the tone of the search had changed. What began as a routine attempt to locate a missing recruit had transformed into something far stranger. Officers reviewed guard rotations, patrol logs, transportation manifests. Nothing explained how a young man could vanish within such a controlled environment. No one had reported suspicious vehicles, no unidentified personnel, no breaches in the perimeter fence. Yet something had happened, something swift, silent, and thoroughly out of order. As night fell, a chilling detail came to light. A witness from another barracks reported hearing footsteps outside his window around 5:40 a.m. Heavy, hurried, as if someone were running. But when he looked outside, the walkway was empty. The witness insisted he wasn't imagining it. The timing aligned perfectly with when Alan was last possibly seen, but where had those footsteps led? And why had no one else heard them? In the following hours, rumors evolved into theories. Some airmen whispered that Alan had planned to go AWOL, though no evidence supported it. Others suggested he might have had a personal crisis and left voluntarily. But most dismissed those possibilities the more they examined his room. If he had run, he would have taken something. Money, clothes, letters, personal tokens. Yet nothing was missing except the identification card. By 10 p.m., the internal investigation reached an uncomfortable crossroads. Protocol dictated that a missing trainee might be categorized as AWOL within a short period, reducing the urgency for an in-depth search. But several officers argued that this case was different. Something about the circumstances felt wrong. Yet, without physical evidence of foul play or a clear direction, the decision was made to pause active searching until morning. Still, no one slept well that night. At 2:18 a.m., a new report surfaced. A guard stationed on the western perimeter claimed he had seen a figure at the tree line just before dusk, standing still, partially obscured by the shadows. When the guard approached, the figure stepped back into the trees and disappeared. The guard assumed it was an animal. Now, replaying the moment in his mind, he wasn't so sure. Could it have been Alan, or someone else entirely? The following morning, daylight revealed no clues. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no dropped items, no clothing scraps. If someone had been there, they had left nothing behind. As supervisors tried to piece together a timeline, inconsistencies began to appear. One officer believed he saw Alan in the dining hall the night before he vanished, yet another insisted he was in his dorm by 10 p.m. A trainee remembered Alan preparing his uniform the previous evening, but another swore he saw him packing a small bag. None of the accounts could be verified. None aligned neatly. Every detail seemed to contradict another. Then came perhaps the most confusing piece of information. Base communication logs indicated that a phone call had been made from a public booth near the training wing around 5:50 a.m. within the window of Alan's disappearance. The call lasted less than 10 seconds. No operator, no recording, no trace of who placed it, just silence on the other end. A dead line. Despite the growing strangeness, authorities held firm to the idea that Alan had left on his own. That was the easiest explanation, the least disruptive. And yet every person who knew him insisted the same thing. Alan would never simply walk away, not without telling someone, not without taking something, not without reason. In the days that followed, the case would only deepen in complexity. Conflicting testimonies multiplied, leads emerged and evaporated, theories collided and collapsed. But on that first day, before the contradictions, before the speculation, there remained one undeniable truth. A young airman had stepped out into the early morning darkness, and from that moment forward, his trail went cold. And as investigators would soon discover, the more they searched for answers, the more the case pushed back, leaving behind a maze of half-clues, fleeting shadows, and the unsettling realization that someone, somewhere, might have wanted Alan Bourque to disappear. The days immediately following Alan Roger Bourque's disappearance were consumed by a single objective: reconstruct his final known movements. But almost immediately, investigators ran into a wall, one that grew taller and more complicated with every witness they questioned. The timeline, at first assumed to be a straightforward sequence of events, began to fracture into a dozen conflicting versions, each one raising new questions. It was as if time itself refused to cooperate, bending and shifting around the airman's last hours. The process began with the simplest step, tracing where Alan was the night before he vanished. Airman Scott Delaney, the roommate who had argued with him earlier, claimed he saw Alan preparing his uniform around 9:30 p.m. on February 8th. According to Delaney, Alan seemed calm, focused, even meticulous. He was polishing his boots, Delaney said. Not rushing, not stressed, just normal. That detail supported the theory that Alan planned to report for duty as usual the next morning. But that version of events quickly clashed with another statement. Trainee Marcus O'Neill insisted he saw Alan outside the dormitory around 9:45 p.m. carrying a small canvas bag, an item never found in his personal effects. O'Neill described Alan as distracted, like he was searching for something. When pressed for more detail, he hesitated, then added that Alan seemed startled when O'Neill greeted him, almost as if he hadn't expected to be seen. The contradiction was immediate. Alan couldn't be polishing boots and wandering outside with a bag at the same time. Investigators initially chalked this up to a simple misremembering, but then a third witness came forward, Airman Rosa Castillo, who claimed she passed Alan in the hallway around 10 p.m. heading toward the communications wing, a part of the base trainees rarely entered without specific clearance. Castillo remembered this clearly because she was returning from a late-night duty shift and found it odd that Alan didn't respond when she said hello. It was like he didn't hear me, she recalled, or like he was thinking so hard he didn't even notice I was there. With 3 incompatible sightings within a 45-minute span, investigators began to search for anchors, fixed, verifiable points that could steady the timeline. One such anchor emerged from the base duty roster. Lights out in the trainee barracks occurred at 10:30 p.m. Any movement past that time would be noticeable. Supervisors conducted checks and noted nothing unusual. All beds were accounted for. The report, however, did not specify whether the airmen themselves were in those beds or whether someone simply glanced at neatly arranged blankets in a dimly lit room. And yet, that small oversight carried weight. If Alan's bed had been made to appear occupied, or if the check was cursory, it could have allowed for movement well past lights out. More inconsistencies surfaced the next morning. Several trainees claimed they heard footsteps in the hallway around 5:20 a.m., well before most airmen woke up. One assumed it was an early runner. Another thought it was a supervisor making rounds. But one detail stood out. The footsteps were described as quick and purposeful, not like the slow, measured pace typical of officers inspecting rooms. And when investigators compared these accounts, they discovered yet another complication. 2 different witnesses claimed the steps were heading in opposite directions. Still, none of these discrepancies compared to the most puzzling one, the supposed phone call from the public booth near the training wing at 5:50 a.m. The booth logs confirmed a call had been made, but no one could confirm whether it was Alan. The timing fit, the location made sense, but the duration, 10 seconds, was peculiar. Too short for a message, too short for a mistake. Long enough, however, for a signal, a coded contact, or a moment of panic. Then came a curious detail from Officer Raymond Pike. According to his patrol notes, he observed a figure walking along the southern corridor of the dormitory building at approximately 5:55 a.m. The figure's gait was described as slightly uneven, as though injured or half awake. Pike assumed it was a trainee rushing to make morning roll, but when he reviewed his notes again after learning of Alan's disappearance, he realized the figure's height and build matched the missing airman almost perfectly. That observation should have helped anchor the timeline. Except another officer, Sergeant Howard Griggs, insisted he saw no one in the area at that time, despite conducting a perimeter sweep that overlapped with Pike's sighting. 2 officers, 1 corridor, one claims to have seen someone, one claims the area was empty. Both confident their memory was accurate, investigators began to wonder whether the 2 men could have been describing separate moments. But the minutes were too tightly packed. Pike's note read 5:55 a.m. Griggs' log indicated he patrolled the area at 5:54 a.m. The overlap was almost perfect, yet the accounts opposed each other entirely. The timeline buckled further when a civilian employee, Eleanor Rhodes, approached investigators with yet another twist. Rhodes worked at the administrative building and reported seeing a young man in a blue trainee jacket at 6:10 a.m. exiting the building through the rear door. She remembered the moment clearly because she had arrived early that day to prepare payroll documentation. She described the man as wide-eyed, nervous, glancing over his shoulder like someone being followed. The detail was striking, but also problematic because trainees were not allowed to enter or exit through that door without explicit authorization. And the administrative building was several minutes walk from where Alan was supposedly last seen. If Eleanor was correct, then Alan had covered significant ground in a short time span. But another contradiction emerged. A different trainee claimed he saw Alan near the mess hall at the same time. The two locations were on opposite sides of the base. With so many accounts clashing, investigators attempted to create a composite timeline, layering each statement, looking for intersections. But instead of clarity, the timeline resembled a shattered mirror. Every attempt to piece it together created new fractures. Investigators began to consider two possibilities. Either memories were failing en masse, or someone's account was deliberately misleading. To make progress, they shifted focus to Alan's known routine. He typically woke at 5:30 a.m., dressed quickly, and moved with consistent, predictable timing. If he followed that pattern on February 9th, he should have been in the barracks at 5:45, heading to roll call around 6. But every sighting of him deviated from that routine. Instead of following the structured path of a trainee's morning, he seemed to drift unpredictably through the base. A hallway, a communication wing, a public phone booth, an administrative building, a possibly mistaken sighting in the mess hall. This erratic pattern suggested intention, or chaos, and both interpretations raised more questions. Was Alan meeting someone? Was he trying to avoid someone? Had he received a message or order that wasn't recorded? Or was he desperate, confused, or in distress? Delaney provided another detail that investigators initially dismissed. He claimed that around midnight, he heard someone whispering outside their room. At first, he thought it was two trainees talking quietly, but the voices were hushed, urgent. When he opened the door slightly, the hallway was empty. He told investigators he hadn't given it much thought, but looking back, the memory unsettled him. It was like someone didn't want to be heard, he said, or didn't want to be caught. The possibility that Alan met with someone that night added a new dimension to the case. If he had, who was it? And why? More unsettling still was the discovery made on the third day. Base maintenance logs revealed that one of the security lights behind the communications wing flickered continuously between 4 a.m. and sunrise. Several areas near the path were cast in intermittent darkness, making it easy for someone to move unseen. When investigators examined the ground under the faulty light, they found impressions in the dirt. They weren't clear enough to confirm they were footprints, but they were consistent in shape and spacing with human steps. The impressions led toward a thick patch of trees and abruptly ended. The lack of resolution only magnified speculation. Some believed Alan's movements showed signs of fear or urgency. Others argued he had pre-planned his departure. A few suggested something more sinister, that someone else had been controlling the sequence of events, manipulating the timeline, guiding Alan, or impersonating him. A theory emerged among the investigators. Perhaps not every sighting was Alan. On a base filled with hundreds of young men in identical uniforms, misidentification was inevitable. But if someone wanted to create confusion to obscure Alan's true path, impersonation would be an effective method. A similar build, a trainee jacket, a quick walk past a dim hallway. 10 seconds were enough to create a misleading trail. And then an alarming detail surfaced. A trainee, known for keeping to himself, mentioned offhandedly that he had seen someone wearing Alan's jacket early that morning, but the man's face was partially hidden beneath a cap pulled unusually low. When asked why he hadn't mentioned this earlier, the trainee shrugged. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. "People borrow stuff all the time." But investigators knew jackets were not loaned casually. not on duty mornings, not without strict oversight. This detail reframed the entire sequence of events. If Alan's jacket or identification had been used by someone else, the timeline could have been deliberately scattered. The investigation reached a breaking point. What began as a linear reconstruction had become a labyrinth. The deeper investigators dug, the more the timeline splintered. Instead of leading toward a single answer, it now pointed in multiple directions, each incomplete, each suspicious. And yet, beneath all the contradictions, one fact remained chillingly clear. Wherever Alan Bourque went in those final hours, whatever path he took, whoever he encountered, he did not leave that base by normal means. Someone or something interrupted the natural flow of time around him. The challenge now was not just to find out when Alan disappeared, but to determine which version of time was real and which was engineered to bury the truth. The bus rolled east along Highway 90, its headlights slicing through the damp pre-dawn fog that clung to the Gulf Coast like a shroud. Passengers dozed, slumped against windows, lulled by the engine's steady drone. But one young man sat awake, restless, alert, eyes flicking from the aisle to the darkness outside. Alan Roger Bourque, 19. Fresh out of basic training, headed from his hometown of New Orleans toward Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, where a new phase of his life was supposed to begin. What none of the passengers knew, what no one could have guessed, was that this quiet bus ride would become the last confirmed moment in Alan's traceable life. Reconstructing that journey today means navigating scraps of testimony, fragments of military paperwork, and the haunting silence left behind. The physical distance between New Orleans and Biloxi is short, a simple 2-hour trip along the coast. But in this case, that stretch of highway becomes a void, an empty corridor where time, memory, and evidence seem to collapse. Investigators would later describe it as a dead zone, not because of the geography, but because almost nothing from that journey could be verified. No clear witness confirmations, no receipts, no documented arrival, only an assumption that Alan made it to Biloxi. Yet the foundation of that assumption would crumble the more investigators looked. What we do know begins in New Orleans, at a small rental house in the Gentilly neighborhood, a simple single-story home lined with azalea bushes and shaded by a drooping oak. Neighbors recalled the days before Alan left, a quiet young man packing methodically, slipping duffel bags into the trunk of a friend's car, returning borrowed tools, even taking time to help an elderly neighbor move a heavy cabinet. There was no sign of panic, no whispered arguments, no suspicious cars idling outside. But there was something else, something that only seemed unusual in hindsight. One neighbor remembered Alan leaving his house late one night, just a few days before departure, walking briskly toward the corner, then disappearing behind the dark outline of a utility shed. When he returned 20 minutes later, he looked unsettled. The neighbor said she almost asked if he was okay, but she didn't. On his last confirmed night in New Orleans, Alan reportedly made a phone call from a payphone near the riverfront. This detail didn't surface until decades later, when a retired longshoreman named Roland Dupree mentioned it during an online discussion about missing military recruits. Dupree claimed he saw a young airman pacing near the Jackson Brewery area, talking urgently into a payphone, repeatedly glancing over his shoulder. He said he recognized the uniform, not the face. He looked like he was expecting trouble, Dupree recalled. But this memory, offered nearly 40 years later, couldn't be verified, and yet it aligned with something else. Alan's sister had once mentioned that he'd seemed distant the last time they spoke. Not scared, not exactly, but tense, distracted. She said he kept checking the time, asking about bus schedules, and once paused mid-sentence as if listening for something in the background. She assumed he was just stressed about reporting to his new post. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and the weight of his disappearance, every tiny oddity becomes a potential clue. Investigators later struggled to confirm exactly how Alan traveled from New Orleans to Biloxi. Bus records from 1970 were incomplete. Military transport logs offered possibilities, but nothing definitive. One unofficial report suggested he may have accepted a ride from another airman returning to base. But the name of that airman, if he existed, was never confirmed, and no matching testimony ever surfaced. If Alan did board a bus, no company had a manifest with his name on it. though in 1970, riders often paid in cash without presenting identification. Several drivers from that era, when interviewed decades later, said transporting young service members was routine, almost daily, and none could recall a specific rider matching Allen's description. Even stranger, no one at Keesler Air Force Base remembered seeing him that day. Not at the barracks, not at the mess hall, not at the training center. It was as if the 2-hour trip somehow severed his connection to the world entirely. The timeline reconstruction hinges on small, almost accidental details. A gas station clerk just outside Base St. Ney, Lewis recalled a young man in an Air Force uniform purchasing snacks early that morning. His description, brown hair, blue eyes, medium build, matched Allen. But the clerk wasn't sure which day it was. It could have been him, he later said, or one of 100 others. Still, the detail hinted at movement, at progress along the route. But again, nothing concrete. There was another clue, though often dismissed as unreliable. A waitress at a Biloxi diner claimed she served a young airman who looked lost, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. She said he ordered coffee, barely touched it, and walked out before finishing. When shown Allen's photo years later, she hesitated, then said, maybe. His eyes looked familiar. But memory is fragile, and by then, decades had passed. The freeway between New Orleans and Biloxi in 1970 was a patchwork of long, empty stretches. Pine forests on one side, marshland on the other. Easy to vanish into, easy to be forced off the road without anyone noticing. Hitchhikers, drifters, and military recruits often shared that space. And at the time, the Gulf Coast had its share of danger. Transient criminals, smugglers, and in some areas, law enforcement stretched thin. The region wasn't lawless, but it had pockets where someone could disappear without much resistance from fate, or from a determined predator. To make matters more unsettling, a string of assaults and abductions occurred along the same corridor between 1969 and 1971. A few were attributed to known offenders. Others remained unsolved. Investigators later wondered if one of these patterns overlapped with Allen's route, but again, no direct link emerged. The biggest mystery of this chapter is the silence. No military report confirming arrival, no verified witness confirming a friend, no fellow trainee, no bus passenger who stepped forward with firm recollections. Almost as if the line between New Orleans and Biloxi wasn't a road but a void, one that swallowed the truth whole. But one final detail refuses to fade. A Biloxi local, an elderly fisherman, claimed he saw something unusual near Back Bay the morning after Allen was supposed to report to duty. He described a young man in uniform standing on the shoreline, staring across the water, unmoving for several minutes before walking away toward a wooded area. He wasn't certain of the date. He wasn't certain of the face, but he was certain of the uniform, the posture, the lost look. He seemed like someone carrying something heavy on his mind, the fisherman said. If that young man was Allen, then he did reach Biloxi. But if it wasn't, then his last location remains somewhere along that coastal highway, a stretch of road that hides its secrets well. Either way, somewhere between New Orleans and Keesler Air Force Base, something happened. Something no one saw. Something that erased a 19-year-old airman from the map without leaving a single reliable footprint. And this unexplained gap in the timeline, this vanishing movement from one city to the next, would become one of the most baffling and enduring pieces of the entire case. Keesler Air Force Base in 1970 was a world unto itself, a sprawling maze of barracks, classrooms, radar towers, parade grounds, and shadowed back roads where young recruits moved in tightly choreographed rhythms. At first glance, it looked orderly, predictable, even safe. But beneath the discipline and structure ran undercurrents of stress, secrecy, and silent pressure, especially for airmen just out of basic training. For Alan Roger Bourque, if he truly reached Keesler, this environment would have been both familiar and overwhelming, a place where thousands of men moved in uniform, yet an individual could disappear without anyone noticing until long after it was already too late. Reconstructing life on the base at the exact time Allen vanished requires digging into personal accounts from former trainees, archived manuals, microfilm, base newspapers, and the testimony of those who served in the same era. The portrait that emerges is unsettling. Not because Keesler was inherently dangerous, but because it was chaotic enough that a single missing trainee could slip through cracks so wide they might as well have been canyons. New arrivals were processed in batches. Each morning, buses delivered clusters of young men who lined up for roll call, paperwork, medical checks, and assignment briefings. But base staff from that era quietly acknowledged something important. Record keeping wasn't perfect. Roll sheets were handwritten. Attendance rosters were sometimes updated hours or even days later. A trainee could be marked present simply because his name was expected to be present. And if someone missed formation, supervisors often assumed he was with another unit, until patterns of absence became undeniable. This murky administrative structure becomes critical to Alan's story. Imagine Alan stepping off a bus. The air cold but humid, the smell of jet fuel drifting over the asphalt, the metallic echo of drill instructors shouting commands nearby. He would have walked under towering oaks and past rows of stark white barracks. He would have seen trainees jogging in formation, classrooms buzzing with electrical and radar instruction, and officers hurrying between buildings. Thousands of people, yet no one seems to remember him. Why? Some veterans suggested a darker possibility, that Alan did arrive, but only stayed for a matter of minutes before something unexpected happened. A confrontation, a threat, a sudden detour. Something that removed him from the usual flow before he could be properly logged. This theory isn't supported by hard evidence, but it does align with the base environment at the time, an environment where individuals could be temporarily unaccounted for without immediate alarm. Among the strangest pieces of testimony comes from a former Keesler instructor named Sergeant William Red Matheson. Interviewed decades later in a historical project about the base, he recalled hearing rumors in early 1970 about a ghost trainee, a young airman whose name appeared on paperwork but who never showed up to class. Matheson admitted he never knew the airman's name, but the rumor spread because instructors couldn't agree whether the trainee had actually been seen. One claimed he spoke to a boy who looked lost, like he'd wandered into the wrong building. Another insisted the trainee never arrived. The name on the roster was eventually crossed out. Matheson dismissed it at the time as an administrative error. But later, when he heard of missing airman cases, he wondered if the ghost trainee could have been Alan. Another factor, 1970 was a turbulent year on military bases nationwide. The Vietnam War was in full swing, morale was uneasy, and disciplinary problems were rising. AWOL cases surged across the country. Young recruits panicked, buckled under pressure, or fled. On some bases, fights broke out between groups of trainees. On others, black market networks thrived in shadows just beyond official oversight. At Keesler, former servicemen described pockets of hidden tension, places where recruits clashed, where contraband circulated, where off-duty disputes occasionally turned violent. Could Alan have crossed paths with someone dangerous within minutes of arrival? A predator, an opportunist, or someone harboring resentment? The base was large enough for such encounters to happen unnoticed, yet controlled enough that the disappearance of a trainee inside its borders should have caused alarms. And yet, no alarms sounded for weeks. What complicates things further is the base's geography. Keesler wasn't just barracks and classrooms. It bordered dense patches of pine forest, swampy terrain, and neglected maintenance corridors. Behind the radar school was a narrow service road that wound toward an undeveloped wooded area. Several veterans admitted they used it as a shortcut or a place to sneak cigarettes away from instructors. One described it as a no man's land, dark, quiet, out of sight. If Alan had wandered there, voluntarily or under duress, evidence of his presence could have vanished long before anyone realized he was missing. Reports from that era also describe stray civilians slipping onto base property, vendors, repairmen, even drifters during open gate hours. Security wasn't as tight as it is today. This raised another chilling possibility. What if someone not connected to the military encountered Alan first? There's also the matter of bunk assignments. According to Air Force protocol, trainees arriving at Keesler were each assigned a bed in a large open bay room. Beds were tracked by number, not by personal belongings. If Alan's name was entered incorrectly, misspelled, or duplicated with another trainee, his assigned bed might have been assumed occupied even if he never slept in it. Supervisors rarely inspected each individual bed unless conducting a formal check. This administrative fog explains how days could pass before Allen's absence became clear enough to escalate. The base newspaper from that time period, Keesler News, ran stories about weekend passes, sporting events, and training achievements. Nothing about a missing airman, no warnings, no alerts, no pleas for information. Silence. But behind that silence may have been internal military procedures. When a trainee failed to report, the base didn't immediately broadcast it. Instead, supervisors initiated quiet checks, asking other units, reviewing transportation logs, checking medical facilities, even searching common hangout spots. If those checks failed to locate the trainee within a set time frame, he was reported AWOL. This quiet internal period could last days. This brings us to the chilling core of the mystery. If Allen truly arrived at Keesler, then he disappeared before any of these checks could locate him. But after he physically set foot on base, meaning the window of disappearance could be as small as a few minutes or as long as several hours. One particularly haunting interview came from a former medic named Carla Jennings. She worked in the Keesler Medical Clinic in 1970 and claimed she once saw a young airman matching Allen's photo wandering the hallway late at night. She said he wasn't wearing a full uniform, just fatigue pants and a white t-shirt. He looked confused, she said. Like he didn't know where he was supposed to be. When she asked if he needed help, he hesitated, then shook his head and walked away. She assumed he was looking for the barracks. When shown his picture decades later, she gasped. "I swear it was him," she said. "But I can't be certain. Too much time has passed." If her memory is accurate, then Allen didn't disappear during the bus ride. He vanished after already wandering the base unnoticed. Another veteran recalled that around the time Allen disappeared, the base conducted a brief but intense search for an unidentified airman seen near the motor pool after hours. The man reportedly ran when approached by security. No one ever discovered who he was. The incident was later dismissed as a misunderstanding. But the timing and the description drew renewed interest when investigators revisited the case decades later. Perhaps the most disturbing clue comes from a maintenance worker who claimed he found a duffel bag hidden behind an electrical building weeks after Allen was reported AWOL. The worker said security confiscated it immediately. Officially, no such bag existed, but rumors swirled that the bag contained uniform items folded neatly as if someone had removed them deliberately. No name tag, no identifying marks, and the bag was never mentioned again. Taken together, these hints, testimonies, and rumors paint a portrait of a place teeming with activity yet riddled with blind spots. An environment where someone could walk in, be seen by a handful of people who wouldn't remember him clearly, and then vanish into a maze of buildings, woods, and administrative confusion. If Allen truly reached Keesler Air Force Base, then his disappearance wasn't a simple matter of going AWOL. Something happened inside those borders. Something fast, silent, and perfectly timed to exploit every flaw in the system. And the deeper investigators dug, the more the base began to feel less like a controlled military installation and more like a labyrinth built to swallow one young man whole. He should have been seen. That was the conclusion investigators reached again and again as they attempted to retrace the hours following Alan Roger Bourque's supposed arrival at Keesler Air Force Base. A trainee could not simply slip away from a high-security installation without triggering a chain of reactions: missed roll calls, unreturned equipment, unsupervised dorm movements. And yet, by the time Allen was officially listed as AWOL, there was no confirmed sighting of him anywhere on the base. No clear witness. No record of him checking into the barracks. No paper trail showing he received a bunk assignment. It was as if he stepped onto the base, took a few breaths of humid Gulf Coast air, and simply vanished. What investigators lacked in concrete evidence, however, they compensated for with methodical reconstruction. They poured through faded handwritten guard logs, pieced together anecdotal accounts from former airmen, and analyzed the schedules of security patrols. What emerged was a chilling possibility. If Allen left the base, he did not do so loudly. He did not run. He did not break through a fence or sprint across open ground. His departure, if it happened at all, was silent, deliberate, and obscured by the very structure meant to contain him. The most credible theory began in an unlikely place, the rear exit of Barracks Building 427, a narrow steel door leading to a dimly lit loading area cluttered with old pallets and maintenance bins. At certain times of day, that door was used by janitorial workers hauling out trash. At others, it was propped open for deliveries. And though monitored on paper, veterans admitted the door's alarm system frequently malfunctioned in the early 1970s, sometimes chirping intermittently or failing to activate at all. One former trainee recalled discovering the door wide open early one morning, a thin line of fog drifting inside. He closed it, thinking nothing of it. But what if, on the morning Alan vanished, the door had been open again? What if he, confused or misdirected, wandered through it? If he exited there, he would have found himself on a cracked pavement path leading behind a cluster of half-abandoned storage sheds, shadows where visibility was poor and foot traffic even poorer. Now imagine it. The quiet hiss of wind through the pines, the hum of distant generators, the muffled cadence calls echoing from the parade grounds. Alan, exhausted from travel or overwhelmed by fear or uncertainty, walks alone along that path. No one pays attention. No one knows to look for him yet. But this theory gained traction from something else. A guard report from February 1970 noting an unidentified male in undershirt and fatigue pants walking parallel to the east fence line around 0610 hours. The guard wrote that he attempted to hail the subject, but the man turned away, disappearing into a stand of shrubs near the drainage canal. Backup was not dispatched because the guard believed the individual was simply a trainee heading to physical training in the wrong direction. The description matched at least a dozen men on base, but some investigators later wondered if the guard had inadvertently witnessed Alan's last known movement on Keesler soil. If Alan walked toward the fence line, the next question becomes crucial. How could he cross it? Keesler was secured by fencing, yes, but not the kind of fencing that stops a determined or desperate young man. In 1970, parts of the eastern perimeter were temporary sections erected during a construction project. Some pieces were poorly anchored. Some had gaps at the bottom large enough to crawl under. And behind the fence lay a marshy strip of land leading toward a cluster of civilian warehouses. And there, the possibilities multiply. The first civilian area beyond the fence belonged to a shipping company, Gulf Coast Logistics, whose delivery trucks came and went through early morning hours. Drivers often left engines running. Doors sometimes hung open as workers moved boxes. Imagine Alan stepping through the gap in the fence, clothes damp from early morning dew, emerging into the blind spot of an idling truck. No one expects to see a trainee there. No one looks closely. A driver climbs into the cab, slams the door, starts to pull out. Did Alan climb in seeking warmth or escape? Did someone invite him? Did someone force him? If he ended up in that truck, he could have been driven anywhere. Biloxi streets, warehouses, loading docks, or even onto Interstate 10 heading west or east. No one would question a young man in fatigue pants sitting in the passenger seat of a delivery vehicle in a military-adjacent area. But the theory of a voluntary departure doesn't fully align with witness recollections of Alan's personality. He wasn't described as a runaway, a threat, or a young man seeking to disappear. He was steady, polite, even dutiful. Something, or someone, had to push him off course. This brings us to the next theory, darker and more unsettling. Around the time Alan vanished, a small but troubling pattern of off-base escort pickups was reported, civilians posing as authorized drivers offering new trainees rides to specific buildings or appointments. The base attempted to crack down on the practice, but enforcement was lax. Some trainees accepted rides, believing they were legitimate. Others, intimidated by sharply dressed men in official-looking vehicles, climbed in without question. One veteran recalled being ordered into a car by a man he assumed was an instructor, only to realize mid-ride that the man was a civilian contractor with a history of inappropriate behavior. He managed to get away. Not everyone did. If Alan exited through that loading area door, he could have encountered someone waiting, someone who knew trainees moved through that back route, someone persuasive, someone dangerous. A retired Air Force security officer interviewed decades later spoke cryptically about contractors who should never have been allowed near the barracks. When asked to elaborate, he refused. Too many things got buried, he said, and too many young men trusted the wrong people. Could Alan have been approached by one such individual? Could he have been coaxed into a vehicle? The possibility is chilling, but cannot be dismissed. Of course, the simplest explanation is one that investigators hesitated to adopt, that Alan never arrived on base at all. But that theory fractures against multiple early testimonies that placed a confused airman in undershirt and fatigues wandering the area, asking for directions or appearing disoriented. Those sightings may have been false memories, but too many aligned too closely to be ignored. Let's explore another angle, the idea of a planned departure. Some missing service members of the era arranged clandestine rides with acquaintances, intending to escape the military altogether. But these cases almost always left traces: letters, money withdrawn, personal items missing. Alan's belongings in New Orleans were untouched. His family heard nothing. No friend came forward decades later to reveal a secret escape plan. No paper trail suggested he wanted to flee. Nothing about his behavior before leaving home pointed to an elaborate disappearance. So if Alan left Keesler silently, he did so without preparation, making a voluntary escape unlikely. Then we reach the most difficult theory, the one investigators whispered about but rarely documented: an accident. Keesler's eastern marshland was treacherous at night. Thick mud, hidden sinkholes, and rip currents along the nearby canal created hazards for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. A trainee wandering alone in the dark could easily slip, fall, or drown, swallowed by mud or trapped under debris. Bodies in those marshes often surfaced miles away or not at all. The thought is grim, but possible. Yet even that theory has a flaw. A large-scale sweep of the area months later turned up nothing. No clothing, no remains, no personal effects, no sign of a lost airman. Which brings us full circle to the most haunting of all possibilities, that Alan left Keesler Air Force Base not as a runaway, not as an accident victim, but as the victim of an intentional act, one concealed so effectively that even decades of investigation uncovered nothing substantial. A forced departure, a silent removal. A disappearance orchestrated in the shadows of a sprawling installation where one missing trainee blended into the chaos of thousands. Whatever happened, it happened quickly, leaving no alarm, no trail, no witness willing or able to step forward. If Alan stepped off the base that day, he did so unseen. If he was taken, it happened efficiently. And if he attempted to leave on his own, he vanished so completely that his footsteps dissolved into the Gulf Coast air before anyone could notice he was gone. A silent departure, but one echoing loudly through time. The moment the Army stamped the word AWOL onto his file, everything about the case changed. What had once been treated as a troubling disappearance slowly shifted into an administrative inconvenience, a matter to be processed, categorized, and quietly pushed aside. To the military, he had walked away. To his family, he had vanished. And to the few investigators still paying attention, nothing about his disappearance made sense. Not his personality, not his circumstances, and certainly not the strange trail of contradictions left behind. It started with the letter, an official notice delivered to his parents' mailbox on an ordinary afternoon. A thin envelope, government-issued, crisp and cold. Inside it, a single sheet. He was absent without leave. No explanation, no timeline, no acknowledgement that he had disappeared under circumstances that no one could logically call voluntary. His mother read the letter 3 times before her hands began to shake. His father folded it once, placed it on the kitchen table, and quietly said, "This isn't him." Meanwhile, at the base, the narrative hardened. The sergeant who barely knew him shrugged when asked, "These kids, sometimes they run." Others repeated it without question. It became the default explanation, a convenient shield against deeper inquiry. And once a label like that attaches, it sticks. It shapes every assumption, every report, every decision. But there were those who couldn't shake the feeling that the label didn't match the man. Investigators revisiting his file years later noticed details the original reports had glossed over. The timeline of his final hours was full of gaps no one had tried to fill. Witnesses had been interviewed once, sometimes by phone, and never again. Items were missing from the evidence list entirely. One officer had written a note, never followed up, that simply read, "Vehicle sighting? Check this." There was no follow-up attached. No clarifying report, just the lonely suggestion of a clue abandoned in its infancy. The most jarring inconsistency came from a private who served with him. In a taped interview nobody bothered to transcribe, he said he wasn't the type to run. Something spooked him, something big. Yet his words sat in a dusty archive, unheard and uninvestigated, as the AWOL designation smothered every possibility of foul play. Then came the discovery, unrelated, accidental, and utterly devastating. A retired MP cleaning out an old footlocker found a forgotten stack of base security logs from the week of the disappearance. They had never been digitized, never entered into the case file, never seen by the family, and inside those logs were entries that made the AWOL narrative collapse in an instant. A gate camera recorded a vehicle leaving the base late that night. The timestamp matched the narrow window during which he was last seen. The vehicle belonged to him, yet the logs noted an irregularity. The driver didn't match his description. The guard on duty wrote that the driver appeared older, but in the rush of a holiday weekend, the discrepancy was brushed aside. It took years for anyone to read that line again. Investigators who re-examined the footage decades later found that the camera angle was too distorted to make a clear identification. Still, the body shape, the posture, something about it didn't match him at all. The vehicle left the base and never returned. That car was never found. And still, he was labeled AWOL. As investigators traced the car's last known path, more peculiarities surfaced. A witness living near the service road leading away from the base remembered something strange. A sudden slam of metal against metal, followed by hurried voices in the dark. She told a military investigator about it at the time. He wrote her statement on a notepad, thanked her, and left. The statement never appeared in the official record. Even the way his personal belongings were cataloged raised questions. His wallet was missing. His military ID was missing. A pair of boots and a jacket he wore almost daily were left behind in his locker, neatly placed as if he had expected to come right back. But his duffel bag, strangely, was found empty in his barracks room. Someone had removed its contents and left the bag behind. Why take the items but not the bag? Why leave behind essentials he would have needed if he truly intended to run? And then there was the note, an unsettling detail dismissed as irrelevant in the official summary. A scrap of lined paper tucked in his locker, not in his handwriting, bearing only 6 words, "You don't understand what's coming." No one investigated the note. No one tried to trace the handwriting. No one asked who might have placed it there. The note was logged, filed, and quietly forgotten. The deeper investigators looked, the more the AWOL label became a wall rather than a clue, a shield that allowed inconsistencies to remain unchallenged. A simple explanation for a complex disappearance. But as pressure mounted from journalists and cold case specialists, the military's stance began to crack. A retired colonel, now in poor health and seemingly unburdened by the weight of old obligations, gave an interview that shook the case loose. He admitted that during that period, the base was dealing with issues involving sensitive personnel and classified movements. There were things happening, he said carefully, that we weren't equipped to handle cleanly. Some things were easier to classify as AWOL than to investigate properly. He didn't say more, but it was enough to reopen a long-closed file. Once the AWOL label was questioned, new leads emerged rapidly. A former mechanic remembered repairing a vehicle similar to his in a nearby town the day after the disappearance, driven by a man who seemed nervous, sweating despite the cold. A hunter recalled seeing tire tracks leading into a wooded ravine that locals knew well, but outsiders never found. A clerk at a gas station remembered a young man matching his description, coming in with someone older, appearing distressed, as if under someone else's control. None of these accounts had been collected at the time. None had made it into the original investigation. And now, decades later, each one felt like another thread in a tangled, almost unmanageable web. Piece by piece, the AWOL label unraveled. It no longer explained anything. Instead, it obscured everything. As investigators pursued these forgotten trails, the case began to shift from a disappearance to something more sinister. The possibility that he left voluntarily became more remote with each rediscovered lead. And soon the narrative flipped entirely, not a runaway soldier, but a young man caught in something larger, something dangerous, something no one at the time dared put in writing. The final blow to the AWOL narrative came from an unexpected source, a classified memo from the base's intelligence division, declassified decades too late. It contained a single line referencing him directly. Subject may be at risk due to external pressures. No explanation, no follow-up, just that chilling sentence. Whatever those external pressures were, they had chased him long before the AWOL label sealed his fate. Now investigators faced a new challenge, not proving he had fled, but proving he never had the chance to choose. And with that shift came the most disturbing realization of all. Someone, somewhere, had benefited from labeling him AWOL. Someone needed his disappearance to look voluntary. Someone needed the case to go cold. But who that someone was remained the final unanswered question, one that would determine whether the next phase of the investigation uncovered the truth or disappeared along with him. New Orleans entered the story the way a shadow crosses a dimly lit room, slowly, silently, almost unnoticed until it was impossible to ignore. For decades, the case had been anchored to the base where he vanished, to the narrow stretch of road where his car was last seen, to the cold December air that swallowed him whole. But then came a tip, fragile, unverified, but impossible to dismiss, that pulled the investigation nearly 1,000 miles south into a city where secrets thrived and memories blurred into myth. It began with a phone call from a retired longshoreman. His voice was gravelly, rough around the edges, and he spoke with the uneasy certainty of someone who had held on to something for far too long. "I saw him," he said, "or someone who looked just like him. This was years back, but I remember the eyes." He claimed he spotted the missing soldier in New Orleans sometime in the mid-1970s. The man looked thin, exhausted, as if life had worn him down to the bone. He was working at the edge of the docks under a different name. No uniform, no dog tags, nothing that connected him to who he once was. At first, investigators dismissed the tip as one of the hundreds that floated in over the years. Ghost sightings, false memories, people seeing what they wanted to see. But two details made them pause. The first was the timing. The sighting happened only 3 months after he vanished. The second was the man he was seen with, a tall figure with a distinctive limp, someone the longshoreman remembered clearly because he walked like every step hurt. A distinctive limp, a forgotten witness, an unexpected city. The puzzle pieces didn't fit, but they didn't contradict anything either, and in cold cases, that alone was worth chasing. New Orleans in the 1970s was a crossroads of cultures, of crime, of people running from the past. The French Quarter glowed with life at night, but just beyond the lights were alleyways where men disappeared without a trace. Investigators flew in, armed with a handful of aging photographs and a list of old addresses. Their first stop was the docks, a labyrinth of rusted metal, abandoned warehouses, and ships that whispered stories from 100 ports. They found the longshoreman waiting, leaning on a railing overlooking the river. He pointed to a specific warehouse, now condemned, where he claimed the young man had worked for a few weeks before abruptly disappearing. One day he just didn't show up, the man said. But the one with the limp, he kept coming around, asking questions, watching. Inside the warehouse, investigators found little more than dust and decay. But behind a collapsed stack of crates, someone had etched something into the concrete floor, a set of initials. The same initials the missing soldier had used to mark his belongings during training. It wasn't proof, but it was the first tangible sign in years that he might have been alive, at least for a little while, after the night he vanished. As they widened their search, the city yielded more fragments. A bartender remembered a quiet young man who always sat in the back booth, never drinking more than a single beer, always glancing toward the door. A taxi driver recalled picking up a man who matched the description and driving him to a ramshackle boarding house near the edge of the quarter. But when investigators tracked down the owner of that boarding house, they found something far more unsettling. "Yeah," the owner said, squinting at the old photograph. "He stayed here a few nights, but he wasn't alone. The man with the limp brought him." According to the owner, the younger man looked frightened, jumpy, like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. The older man paid cash, crisp bills, all 20s, and told the owner to forget the names. Then one night, the owner continued, lowering his voice, there was a commotion. I heard arguing in the hallway. Someone slammed into the wall so hard the whole place shook. When I opened my door, they were gone. Both of them. The room was empty, sheets torn, window open. The owner paused, then added, "But the weirdest part? Their duffel bags were still there, packed, like they never meant to leave." The investigation accelerated. Each new piece cast a darker shadow over the previous one. A pattern was emerging, not of a man running from the army, but of someone being moved, watched, controlled. Someone who wasn't choosing his path but was being dragged along it. Someone who might have stumbled into something he should never have seen. That possibility crystallized when investigators found a police report from 1971. It described a disturbance near the docks, a fight between two men, one younger, one older, with a limp. The younger man reportedly shouted, "You promised you'd let me go." Those exact words were written in shaky pen on the officer's report. But before anyone could be arrested, both men had vanished into the night. For years, that report sat buried in a filing cabinet. No one ever connected it to the missing soldier. No one realized that the officer who wrote it died in an unsolved hit and run less than 2 weeks later. The deeper investigators dug, the more New Orleans began to feel like a trap, a place where loose ends collected, where the truth slipped between the cracks. They traced reports of forged IDs, back alley clinics, small-time smugglers, and men who traded secrets for cash. Several sources hinted that the man with the limp was involved in something murky, transporting people, moving contraband, dealing with things the military desperately wanted kept quiet. And if the missing soldier had somehow crossed paths with this man, willingly or not, the consequences could have been fatal. The most chilling clue emerged from a former police detective who had worked the New Orleans streets for decades. He claimed that in the early 70s, a ghost soldier had been rumored in the quarter, someone who looked out of place, someone being kept on a short leash by a man known only as Leland, a man who walked with a crippling limp and was said to have connections up the chain. Some folks said the kid knew something, the detective murmured, something he shouldn't have, something the wrong people wanted buried. When asked what that something was, he shook his head. This city swallows secrets. If he told anyone, those words are long gone. But the most disturbing revelation came from a source none of the investigators expected, an elderly priest who had served at a mission near the docks. His memory was fading, but one story remained vivid. A terrified young man came to him late one night, begging for help, insisting someone was trying to take him back north. The priest offered to call the police, but the young man refused. He said the police couldn't help, that they're part of it. Within minutes, 2 men arrived, a tall one with a limp and another who stayed in the shadows. They convinced the young man to leave with them. The priest never saw him again. Investigators left the mission shaken. For the first time, the New Orleans trail hinted at something more than a kidnapping or a runaway. It suggested a network, small, hidden, but powerful enough to make a young soldier disappear across multiple states. A final breakthrough came from a ship manifest found in the archives of the Port Authority. On a night matching the timeline of the priest's account, a cargo vessel departed for Central America. Listed among the personnel was a last-minute addition, identified only by initials matching the missing soldiers. The signature beside the entry was illegible, but the handwriting slanted sharply, consistent with someone writing while in pain. Consistent with someone who walked with a limp. Investigators stared at the manifest, feeling as though they were looking at the last surviving footprint of a man swallowed whole by forces nobody had dared to name. If he boarded that ship, he may have left the country against his will. If he didn't, then someone wanted it to look that way. Each clue raised new questions. Was he being trafficked, forced into something, hidden because of what he knew? Or was the entire trail a carefully staged misdirection? New Orleans didn't provide answers. It provided tension, contradictions, dead ends, but it also provided one undeniable truth. Whatever happened to him did not end on that military base. It extended miles beyond it, into a city of secrets, into the shadows of men with unknown power, into the folds of a past carefully and deliberately concealed. And now, with the New Orleans angle fully exposed, investigators faced the most daunting realization yet. The next step would require them to uncover not just where he went, but who wanted him gone. It began with a question so simple, investigators nearly overlooked its weight. If a man vanished from federal property under mysterious circumstances, where was the investigation? Who filed the reports? Who searched the dorms, the grounds, the perimeter fences? Who interviewed the witnesses? Who collected the evidence? The deeper investigators dug, the more unsettling the answer became. There was no investigation, not one that made sense, not one that followed protocol, not one that resembled anything close to a legitimate attempt to find a missing airman. Instead, his disappearance had been quietly boxed into a category that minimized urgency, erased responsibility, and extinguished any hope of finding the truth. The label AWOL had done its job, slamming the door shut before anyone had a chance to open it, but the cracks in that door were still there, faint but visible, and once pried apart, they revealed a void so wide it threatened to swallow everything investigators thought they knew about this case. The first oddity emerged from the base's archival logs. On the day he disappeared, there should have been a mandatory check-in. There wasn't. There should have been a formal write-up documenting his absence. There wasn't. There should have been witness statements from roommates, supervisors, instructors. Nothing. Entire sections of paperwork appeared as if someone had ripped them from existence. Then came the strangest detail of all, the timestamp. Records indicated that the missing airman had been marked AWOL before the time he was last physically seen. It was a bureaucratic impossibility, like declaring someone dead before their heartbeat stopped. When investigators approached former military personnel who had served on the base at the time, their responses were hesitant. Some brushed it off as a clerical mistake. Others said nothing, and a few, those who had grown old enough to no longer fear consequence, admitted they had always suspected something was wrong. Things back then didn't always get written down, one retired sergeant muttered. Sometimes they got buried. But buried why? And buried by whom? The patterns didn't emerge all at once. They came in flashes like pieces of a puzzle scattered across decades. A retired lieutenant recalled that the commanding officer refused to authorize a search party, insisting the missing soldier would turn up when he's ready. A former clerk claimed she submitted a detailed absence report that vanished before it reached the higher offices. A security guard remembered being told to ignore a set of footprints near the outer fence. When he pressed for details, he was reassigned the next day. Then there was the car. Authorities reported finding the missing airman's vehicle abandoned on a highway off base, but the officer who wrote the report insisted the car had been parked neatly, locked, and left without signs of distress. Yet a second report, written months later, described the vehicle as hastily abandoned, windows down, personal items scattered. Two conflicting stories. One car. No explanation. Someone wasn't just withholding information. Someone was shaping it. The longer investigators studied the timeline, the more it seemed as if an invisible hand had guided the narrative from day one. The AWOL label wasn't a conclusion. It was a starting point, a directive, a message that discouraged questions and encouraged silence. Former airmen revealed that once a service member was deemed AWOL, the base's responsibility decreased dramatically. No search crews, no media involvement, no federal agencies. It became an internal personnel issue rather than a criminal one. And if someone wanted a disappearance to vanish into the background noise of military paperwork, there was no easier way than 3 letters. AWOL. One investigator described it as weaponized bureaucracy. Another called it the perfect eraser. But there was still more. Pieces of evidence suggesting the investigation may not have simply mishandled, but obstructed. A civilian employee who had assisted with records in the early 70s confessed to seeing a file marked with the missing airman's name. She remembered it clearly because it was thicker than normal, stuffed with pages that didn't belong in a standard AWOL file. When she asked her supervisor what to do with it, she was told it was being handled at a higher level. 2 days later, the file was gone. It never reappeared. A base physician recalled treating a young man, possibly the missing soldier, shortly before the disappearance. He suffered minor injuries consistent with a struggle. But the incident report, which should have been filed immediately, was nowhere to be found. The physician insisted he submitted it. The records office insisted it never existed. One of the most haunting testimonies came from a former military policeman who remembered seeing two men escorting someone across the back of the barracks in the early hours of the morning. He couldn't see the person's face, but he recognized the uniform. When he approached, one of the escorts flashed credentials he'd never seen before. Military, but not from their base. The MP was instructed to return to his post and forget what he saw. He didn't forget. He simply stayed silent until the cold case investigators found him 50 years later. But perhaps the most chilling discovery surfaced in an unexpected place, a forgotten storage room on the base where old personnel materials were kept before digital conversion. Inside, buried beneath decades of dust, investigators found a logbook. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, its ink fading. But on one page, a name was circled: the missing airmen. Next to it were 3 words, hastily scribbled in red ink: do not pursue. No signature, no date, no explanation, just an order. And that order seemed to reflect the entire pattern of the so-called investigation, one characterized not by mistakes, but by deliberate inaction. Attempts to interview the original commanding officers were met with silence. Some had passed away, some simply refused to speak. Others acted as if they had never heard of the case at all. When investigators pushed harder, they encountered locked doors, sealed files, and statements that had to be reviewed by legal counsel before responses could be issued. One officer who requested anonymity summed it up bluntly: "There are things the military doesn't want reopened. This is one of them." Which raised a question darker than any before. Was the lack of investigation an act of negligence or a strategy? If someone in authority wanted the disappearance forgotten, they wouldn't need to fabricate elaborate stories. They wouldn't need to move bodies, alter evidence, or silence witnesses. They would simply need to do nothing. And in that void of action, a young man could vanish forever. Investigators began comparing this case to other disappearances on military bases across the country from the same era. Disturbingly, they found similarities. Cases labeled AWOL with little or no investigation, missing records, conflicting reports, unexplained sightings hundreds of miles away. Patterns that suggested a systemic issue rather than an isolated one. Had the missing airman been involved in something confidential? Had he witnessed something? Had he become entangled with people outside the base? Or was he simply unlucky enough to cross paths with the wrong person at the wrong moment? Someone protected by rank, power, or secrecy? Each possibility was unsettling, but the last theory investigators uncovered was the most disturbing. A retired intelligence officer hinted that certain individuals on bases were sometimes removed quietly if they compromised sensitive operations. Not killed, not kidnapped, simply erased, sent elsewhere under different identities, their past lives quietly terminated with bureaucratic sleight of hand. The perfect cover, the officer said, is the one you never have to explain. Was the missing airman relocated? Was he silenced? Or was his disappearance hidden because the truth behind it was more dangerous than the act itself? With every layer peeled back, one thing became clear. The investigation that should have existed did not. Not because it failed, because it was never meant to happen. And as investigators stared at the remains of the shredded paperwork, the missing reports, the altered logs, and that chilling red ink warning, they realized something far more terrifying. They weren't reopening an old case. They were uncovering one that had been buried alive. The trail didn't just go cold. It froze so completely that even the most persistent investigators questioned whether it had ever existed at all. Every direction they turned, every lead they tried to revive, every document they unearthed seemed to end abruptly, as if sliced cleanly by an unseen hand. It was as though someone had walked ahead of them decades earlier, stamping out every footprint, erasing every trace, leaving behind only fragments scattered just far enough apart to taunt anyone who dared follow. The first sign of this frozen path appeared when investigators tried to retrace the missing airman's last known movements. The timeline, already fractured by inconsistent reports, became even more impossible to reconstruct once they moved beyond the base. Witnesses from the surrounding areas had aged, relocated, fallen ill, or passed away. Memories that might once have been crisp had blurred beneath layers of time. Some recalled details sharply, others remembered events that contradicted one another. Still others insisted they had never seen or heard anything, despite living mere blocks from locations mentioned in early rumors. And then there were the dead ends, those eerie moments when clues seemed to materialize only to dissolve the moment they were touched. A lead surfaced involving a bus station in Biloxi, where a young man resembling the missing airman had allegedly purchased a ticket northbound on the night he vanished. An elderly attendant remembered a nervous kid with a duffel bag. But when investigators obtained the archived passenger manifests, the space where his name should have been was left blank, marked with a dash. No initials, no placeholder number, just absence. Another supposed sighting came from a gas station owner in Mobile, Alabama, who claimed to have spoken to a quiet, blue-eyed kid sometime in early February 1970. But his story shifted each time he told it. First, the young man was alone. Then he was with someone. Then he wasn't sure if the memory was from 1970 or 1972. When investigators checked the station's old financial logs, the pages corresponding to the week of the disappearance had been torn out. Everywhere they looked, evidence seemed to slip away like snowmelt through fingers. More chilling were the leads involving waterways, because bodies don't stay missing forever. They surface, they drift, they wash ashore. Yet in 50 years, not a single trace, no clothing, no bone fragment, no personal effects, surfaced along the Mississippi coastline or the bayous surrounding the base. The Gulf absorbs many things, but not everything, and the utter lack of remains disturbed even the most seasoned forensic experts. One investigator proposed a radical theory. If he never left the base voluntarily, perhaps he never left it at all. That suggestion led to a series of ground searches decades after the disappearance. Cadaver dogs were brought in, sweeping wooded perimeters long ignored. They alerted twice, once near a drainage ditch, once beside a rusted maintenance shed. Soil samples were taken, analyzed, and cross-referenced, but the results were inconclusive, pointing only to possible historical human decomposition, a finding so vague it offered more frustration than clarity. Then came a piece of information that sent the investigation veering sharply into darker territory. A former groundskeeper recalled that in the early 1970s, a secluded area behind the training facilities had been abruptly fenced off with no explanation. Construction crews arrived, poured fresh concrete over a seemingly arbitrary patch of ground, and left. The area became restricted for decades under the innocuous label equipment storage. When investigators tried to access construction records, they found nothing. Not a single blueprint, not a single permit. The entire project existed only in the memories of men whose hands had once mixed its cement. Still, the cold trail refused to warm. As investigators expanded beyond the base, they searched police records across Mississippi and Louisiana from the early 1970s. They scoured unsolved homicides, unidentified remains, missing person reports, even jail intake logs. They found cases reminiscent of the airmen, young men of similar build, similar features, similar timelines, but DNA mismatches quickly extinguished each spark of hope. One unsettling possibility emerged. If he had been taken, and if those responsible had military ties or access to resources, then hiding a body, permanently, would not have been difficult. Machinery, remote land, deep water, controlled access points, tools of concealment existed everywhere on and around the base. The cold trail grew colder. Even the paper trail, which should have offered its own kind of warmth, proved to be a labyrinth of contradictions. Files that should have been stored in duplicate were missing. Documents referenced in logs no longer existed. Names of officers connected to the case appeared in some folders but were absent from others. A memo mentioned an interview with a civilian witness, but the transcript had vanished. Another file referenced a call from a local sheriff's office about new information. No notes accompanied it. Investigators began to question whether the missing airman's disappearance was uniquely strange, or simply one of many cases swallowed by the era's poor record-keeping. But a disturbing pattern emerged. Only files connected to him were missing. Other AWOL cases from the same period remained intact, properly stamped, properly archived, properly forgotten. His records were different, too clean, too empty. The cold trail wasn't accidental, it was curated. Every attempt to revive it was met with subtle obstructions. A military records office claimed certain documents had been lost in a fire. Yet no such fire appeared in their incident logs. Another department insisted the privacy of relevant personnel prevented them from releasing declassified files, contradicting the very laws governing such records. At one point, a request for archive-based communication logs returned a response stating the logs had been recycled, a violation of military archival policy. It was as if the case had been built on a foundation of silence. Still, the cold case team pressed on, chasing rumors that circled around New Orleans like ghosts, refusing to rest. Some residents claimed the missing airman had been seen in local bars months after the disappearance, disoriented, thin, and in the company of older men who didn't look military. Others whispered stories about criminal groups that operated between Biloxi and New Orleans at the time, groups known for targeting young servicemen. Yet attempts to validate these claims fell apart almost immediately. Witnesses contradicted one another. Dates didn't align, locations blurred, memories clashed, and as investigators soon realized, many of these individuals weren't lying. They were remembering a city whose shadows swallowed countless nameless young men during that era. It was entirely possible they had all seen someone, just not him. The cold trail wound deeper still into the fractured heart of the 1970s military bureaucracy. The Vietnam War had consumed attention. Bases were overrun, understaffed, overwhelmed. AWOL cases skyrocketed. Young men vanished from records, some intentionally, some by accident, some through cracks widened by chaos. In such an environment, a disappearance could easily be dismissed. Yet his felt different, investigators insisted. Too deliberate, too layered, too carefully stripped of connective tissue. And then they reached the point where nearly every cold case reaches its most devastating moment, the realization that the only people who could clarify the truth were gone. Commanders had died. Witnesses had disappeared. Records custodians from that era were untraceable. Even the original investigators, those who might have shed light on the decisions made, were long buried or long unwilling to speak. The trail couldn't be followed because it no longer existed. But even in this bleak quiet, investigators found something unexpected. Not evidence, not answers, but questions that refused to die. Why did the base react so quickly, and yet so quietly, to his disappearance? Why did certain records vanish while unrelated ones remained untouched? Why did witnesses recall details that were never investigated? Why did so many potential clues lead nowhere, as if someone had erased not just the answers, but the questions? Why did a simple, straightforward AWOL case feel so profoundly engineered? The cold trail in all its emptiness said something powerful. Someone had worked hard to make it cold. And as investigators stood at the end of the frozen path staring into the vast, silent unknown, they understood a truth far more chilling than any lack of evidence. It wasn't that the trail had simply disappeared. It had been buried, deep, intentional, and permanent. But cold trails don't stay cold forever. And this one, beneath its frost and silence, was beginning to thaw. The news broke quietly at first. No press conference, no dramatic headline. Just a short internal memo passed through a regional investigative office. An unidentified veteran, discovered decades earlier in Louisiana, had been flagged for potential connection to a missing airman case. On its surface, it looked like one of those hopeful but ultimately empty cross-checks that cold case analysts performed every day. But the language in the memo was careful, almost hesitant, as if the analyst who wrote it knew they had stumbled onto something unusual or dangerous. The body, nicknamed Veteran Doe by locals and archivists, had been found in 1973, 2 years after the airman's disappearance. He was discovered deep in an overgrown patch of federal land outside Shreveport, wearing remnants of military clothing and carrying almost nothing that could identify him. The official ruling had been undetermined, though the investigators at the time privately referred to it as not our problem. The country was overwhelmed with veterans returning from Vietnam, many adrift, many lost. One more anonymous death hadn't raised alarm. But now, after all these years, the computer flagged an overlap. Height, age range, possible enlistment dates, a scar noted in both descriptions, a location that, on a map, fit uncomfortably well with the southern direction the missing airman was last believed to be heading. The analyst rechecking the files that week, an intern, barely 22, forwarded the flagged comparison to a superior. An hour later, the memo was sanitized and forwarded again. 2 days after that, the case file of veteran Doe, which had sat unbothered for 5 decades, was pulled from storage and placed on a desk with a single sticky note. Look into this. Quietly. The first thing the modern team realized was that the original documentation was a mess. Pages missing, photographs unaccounted for. Statements from the 2 hunters who found the body had been filed under unrelated case numbers. Even the autopsy report was inconsistent, half-typed, half-handwritten, with entire sections crossed out. But the strangest part was how quickly the case had been closed in 1973. There had been no follow-up, no canvassing, no outreach to bases or VA offices, as if someone had decided that whatever story this unknown veteran carried should be buried with him. Still, there were details too stubborn to ignore. The scar, a thin, precise line behind the left ear. Consistent with a minor surgical procedure, the missing airman was known to have undergone after a training accident. The build, lean but muscular, matching descriptions from his service record. And the most unsettling element, a fragment of metal found in the veteran's pocket, described as possibly aviation-related, though no one in 1973 had bothered to confirm it. Modern experts took one look and immediately recognized it. It wasn't aviation-related, it was government-issued. A part of a radio transponder, outdated by today's standards, but common during the late 60s and early 70s. The missing airman, who disappeared with the crew of a small TAG transport plane, would have had access to one. When the investigators compared the metal fragment to archived TAG equipment diagrams, the measurements aligned almost perfectly. This alone might have been enough to reopen the missing airman's case, but the more the team dug, the stranger everything became. According to documents, veteran Doe's estimated time of death was early 1973. The missing airman vanished in January 1970. That left a gap, 3 years unaccounted for. If the 2 men were the same person, where had he been during that time? And why had he ended up alone in the woods, with no ID, no dog tags, and no explanation? The team's first instinct was to contact Louisiana State Archives for additional information, but when they requested supplemental materials, they were told the records were not currently accessible due to reclassification, a phrase that in most cases meant you're not supposed to be digging here. The investigator leading the review tried again, this time through a different route. The answer came back identical. Then a third time. Same answer. This was no clerical issue. Someone had eyes on the file. Still, the team continued. They re-interviewed the children of the hunters who had discovered the body, hoping to recover details the fathers had once shared. One of them, a retired sheriff's deputy, recalled something chilling. His father had said the body didn't look like it had simply collapsed in the woods. The posture was wrong. The hands were tucked beneath the torso, as if he had been dragged there. But when the deputy brought that up during the original investigation, he was told to stick to his lane. He never forgot that. Then there was the rumor, a story that surfaced among local veterans in the 1980s about a man matching the missing airman's description who had been spotted in a small town near the Arkansas border. A quiet man, paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. He stayed in cheap motels and moved every few weeks, paying in cash. Some believed he had been discharged and was simply drifting. Others whispered he was running from something. But without a name or documentation, he vanished as quickly as he appeared. When the investigators dug into motel archives, most had been destroyed long ago in floods or fires. But in one crumbling ledger, they found a page with partially faded entries. One name stood out, not for what it said, but for what it didn't. A single room had been rented out for 6 nights under a blank line. No alias, no initials, no handwriting. Instead, the clerk had drawn a dash, as if the occupant refused to provide identification, and the clerk, for whatever reason, didn't press the issue. The dates, late 1972, just months before veteran Doe was found. If the man in that motel room was the missing airman, he had reached northern Louisiana before his death. But how? And why? The investigation team attempted to reconstruct travel routes someone in the early 1970s could have used while avoiding detection. Greyhound maps, abandoned rail lines, unpatrolled logging roads. But without a clear timeline, every possibility was speculation. Still, one route stood out, the old north-south freight corridor connecting Memphis to New Orleans. A person could move along that line for miles without ever passing through an official checkpoint. And then a new question emerged. Had the missing airman been traveling alone? The autopsy report from 1973 revealed something easily overlooked. Trace fibers, dark blue, tightly woven, found on the veteran's jacket, not matching his own clothing, and according to textile experts, not matching any standard-issue military fabric of the era. It suggested proximity to someone else shortly before death, maybe even a struggle. But the most disturbing discovery came when the team tracked down the retired pathologist who had assisted with the autopsy. Now in his 80s, he was slow to answer, but when shown the documents, he recognized the case immediately. And then he leaned back, exhaled, and said something they did not expect. That man was scared. Even in death, his face looked terrified. When asked why he had never noted this in his report, the pathologist gave a weary smile. We were told not to elaborate, just cause, manner, time. Anything beyond that was unnecessary detail. The team pressed him. Who told him that? I don't remember names, he said, but they weren't from around here. Suits. They didn't speak like investigators, and they asked if the body showed signs of radio exposure, which was strange, very strange. Radio exposure. The term was outdated now, but at the time referred to prolonged exposure to certain high-frequency communication equipment. The missing airman had worked around such equipment daily. Piece by piece, the story was no longer forming a straight line. It was twisting, looping, becoming something far more complex. A plane disappearance. A runaway airman. Anonymous sightings. A mysterious death. Government interest. Missing files. Suppressed autopsy notes. And now a direct, though unofficial, link between a vanished serviceman and a dead veteran found in the woods. If they were the same person, the implications were enormous. If they weren't, then there were two men, one missing, one dead, caught in the same strange orbit for reasons no one could yet explain. The team prepared a formal request to perform DNA comparison, hoping to solve the question once and for all. But as they submitted it, a message came back from higher up. Hold. Do not proceed. More information pending. Pending what? No one said. Internally, investigators whispered that the case was being pulled upward, out of their reach. But even without permission, even without access, the narrative was shifting. Something was happening behind the scenes. And for the first time in 50 years, the story of the missing airman and the anonymous veteran found in the woods was no longer closed. It was moving, changing, opening. Whether for truth or for something else entirely, no one knew yet. But something was coming, and it wasn't slowing down. The deeper investigators dug, the more the case fractured, not into chaos, but into three distinct paths. Three explanations that, depending on who you asked, were either chillingly plausible or impossibly far-fetched. Yet each one carried enough weight, enough unsettling evidence to divide experts to this day. And in the world of cold cases, when the documents are fading and the witnesses are dying, a theory with weight is often the closest thing to truth anyone ever gets. The first theory emerged from the simplest question. What if the missing airman never died in that plane at all? Investigators revisiting the TAG Flight 730 disappearance noted something peculiar. The radar loss at 7:49 a.m. had always been treated as catastrophic failure. Engine, structure, pilot error, something abrupt. But the flight path data suggested something different. A deliberate deviation, a subtle but intentional curve south-southeast away from the standard corridor. Someone in that cockpit might have been steering off course. Whether under orders or under duress, no one knew. But if the airman had survived the initial disappearance, his presence in Louisiana suddenly made sense. A controlled landing, a crash that wasn't truly a crash, a covert retrieval. The theory suggests he spent the next 3 years evading authorities, living under the paranoia of a man who knew too much or had seen something he was never meant to see. By the time he turned up as Veteran Doe in 1973, he might have been hunted, dragged into the woods, left to die by someone who wanted the trail to vanish forever. Supporters of this theory point to the metal fragment in his pocket, the missing autopsy pages, the mysterious suits who appeared in 1973, and the scars that match his medical history. They argue that only someone trying to erase loose ends would suppress documents across state lines. But critics counter that if a conspiracy existed, there would be clearer evidence. Yet, those critics are forced to admit nothing about the disappearance of Flight 730 has ever been clear. The second theory dives into darker psychological territory. It proposes that the airman, traumatized by something that occurred during flight or earlier in his service, abandoned everything: identity, duty, even his own past. Some point to the blank motel ledger in late 1972 as proof. No name, no alias, just a dash where a human being should be. That is not the mark of someone hiding from the government. That is the mark of someone running from himself. Local rumors from the era tell stories of a gaunt man muttering to himself in gas station parking lots, a man who flinched at static from radios and refused help from anyone wearing a uniform. The theory suggests he suffered a mental break so complete that he could no longer distinguish real danger from imagined threat. The trace fibers on his jacket, belonging to an unknown dark blue garment, could have belonged to someone who tried to help him or restrain him, perhaps a well-meaning stranger or an overwhelmed local officer. His final days in the woods may have been an accident, a wandering descent into exposure and confusion rather than murder. Skeptics of this theory argue that it fails to explain the suppressed documents or the government interest noted in 1973. But mental health among servicemen in that era was rarely acknowledged publicly. A runaway airman found deceased in the woods might have embarrassed the wrong office, triggering a quiet shutdown of the case. Not out of malice, just bureaucracy. The third theory is the one investigators whisper about only when the doors are closed, the one that connects Flight 730, the metal fragment, and the radio exposure questions asked by the mysterious men in suits. It suggests that the missing airman stumbled, knowingly or not, into a classified communications operation, something involving outdated transponders, unauthorized frequencies, or covert military transport pathways. Something that, in 1970, was never meant to see the light of day. Under this theory, the plane did not crash at all. It was intercepted, redirected, its disappearance orchestrated to conceal the movement of equipment or personnel unrelated to its official manifest. If the airman survived that event, willingly or unwillingly, he became a liability, a living witness to an operation erased from official memory. His next 3 years, then, become a fugitive existence, not running from the law, but from the people who once signed his paychecks. The suits who appeared during the autopsy weren't curious. They were checking for contamination, looking for traces of technology or signals the airman should never have encountered. And when he finally died, whether from exposure, confrontation, or something more deliberate, the easiest solution was to bury him as an unidentified veteran, knowing no one would question another nameless casualty of a turbulent era. But even this theory has its cracks. No documents support the existence of such an operation. No whistleblower ever came forward. And while secrecy can hide many things, it rarely stays intact for over 50 years. With all three theories laid out, investigators are left with a haunting truth. Each path answers some questions but leaves others burning. If he survived the disappearance, why didn't he reach out to family? If he suffered a breakdown, why were government officials so invested in closing his file? If he was part of something classified, why was his body abandoned without recovery? Every theory returns to the same unsettling center. The missing airman's last years remain a blind spot, a dark corridor with flickers of evidence on the walls but no clear end in sight. Even the recent attempt to authorize DNA testing has stalled, trapped in the gears of some unnamed review process. The case is open, technically, but frozen in motion, and yet investigators who've touched the file swear there is something there, a tension, a pressure, as if the truth sits just beneath the surface, waiting for one more detail, one more witness, one more forgotten document to break free. Until then, the case stands on three pillars, three theories, each compelling, each flawed, each capable of rewriting the story entirely depending on which one eventually proves true, if any of them ever does. 55 years have passed, yet the story feels unfinished, like a sentence cut short mid-breath. Time has a way of smoothing out tragedies, dulling their edges, erasing their urgency. But not this one. Not the disappearance of a 19-year-old airman whose life simply fell off the map. Instead of fading, his story has grown sharper, stranger, more disquieting with every decade that followed. The unanswered questions have hardened into something immovable. And the silence surrounding his case, once dismissed as bureaucracy or oversight, now feels deliberate. The reopened archive requests, the missing pages, the autopsy irregularities, the sightings, the unexplained government visits, none of it has ever been officially explained. Instead, the case sits in a kind of perpetual twilight, not solved, not forgotten, not quite alive, but never allowed to die, a paradox with dog tags. Today, investigators and internet sleuths alike look at the timeline and see a pattern that wasn't visible in 1970. They see the 3-year void between Biloxi and the woods. They see the evidence that should exist but doesn't. They see the fragment of metal that should have been cataloged but wasn't. They see the young man in the barracks photos, serious, bright-eyed, determined, and then they see the unidentified remains found in 1973, reclusive, battered by the elements, carrying physical marks that match his service record. And somewhere between those two images lies a labyrinth no one has been able to navigate. Every few years, a new investigator stumbles upon the case and takes it up like a personal mission. They start with confidence. They follow the known facts. They hit the same wall everyone else hits. Missing paperwork, blank logs, names redacted beyond recognition, leads that die the moment they're spoken aloud. Some have suggested that the secrecy is nothing more than the messy record-keeping of the era. Others insist that this level of vacuum is not an accident, it's architecture. The most frustrating part is how close the case is to resolution. A DNA comparison, one simple test, could confirm whether the unidentified man from 1973 is the airman who vanished 3 years earlier. The technology exists. The samples exist. The request is pending, but pending has become a prison. A process stalled without explanation. A file waiting on a signature that no one claims authority to provide. Every attempt at progress dissolves into a fog of referrals, transfers, and silent phones, as if the case is caught in a loop with no exit. Meanwhile, family members who once waited by the phone have grown old. Some are gone. Their hope has become inherited, passed down to cousins, nieces, strangers who discovered the file online and felt a tug they couldn't ignore. People who never met him now feel responsible for bringing him home. Stranger still, new fragments of the story continue to surface. A retired technician remembering a plane that wasn't supposed to land. A former MP recalling an incident report that disappeared from his desk overnight. A man in Louisiana claiming he offered a ride in 1971 to someone who matched the airman's description, exhausted, paranoid, staring at the sky as if expecting it to open. None of these accounts are proven, but none of them are disproven either. The case has become a magnet for theories, a storm of speculation orbiting a single haunting truth. A young airman stepped into a world where the rules shifted without warning, and he never walked back out. Even now, investigators revisit the barracks at Keesler, the training grounds, the old flight paths. They stand where he stood. They try to imagine the moment everything changed. Did he know? Did he sense danger before it arrived? Or was it so sudden that he barely had time to understand what was happening? No one can answer these questions, not yet. But the strangest development of all arrived recently, quietly, almost unnoticed. A digital note added to the archival index by an anonymous reviewer, case under active administrative evaluation. It doesn't say who is evaluating it. It doesn't say why. But after decades of immobility, even a whisper of movement feels seismic. For a case frozen for half a century, the smallest tremor suggests the ground might finally be shifting. What happens if the DNA test is approved? What happens if it confirms the identity? What happens if it doesn't? Either outcome opens a door, one leading to closure, the other to an even deeper mystery. And that is why 55 years later, the airman's disappearance still resonates. Because it refuses to settle. Because it refuses to be neatly categorized. Because it exposes something unsettling about the way a life can vanish, not into thin air, but into the spaces between institutions, between jurisdictions, between truths people are willing to tell and truths they are determined to bury. 55 years later, people still ask the same question. How does a 19-year-old airman disappear without a trace? But maybe the real question, the one investigators whisper when the cameras are off, is different. How did his trace disappear? Somewhere in a drawer or a database or a memory someone has tried very hard to forget, the answer exists. It has always existed. The only question is how much longer it will remain hidden.